Our top story tonight is Donald Trump's unending humanitarian crisis. Over 2,000 children orphaned with no reprieve from this executive order that Trump rushed out under pressure. And as you know, if you're watching the news, our nation continues to bear witness to what happens when cruelty is deployed as policy. That's how these kids were separated. And then what happens when the chief executive office is rife with what can only be called incompetence? Because the order that President Trump issued yesterday exposes how deeply he and his aides literally did not understand how border enforcement works, why family unity has always been a goal, even within some of the very harshest border policies. Now, tonight, Donald Trump and congressional Republicans have very few answers about how to fix these problems that are still the top story in the country that Donald Trump created. Now, most of these recently separated children do remain alone, but we are starting to get stories of some of the exceptions. Sources telling The Intercept that this video shows what may very well be the first mother and child reunited. This is in Texas, and since the Trump administration started splitting up families in May.
Tan feliz que tengo a mi hijo, yo soy feliz. Nos dormimos como a las 11:30, casi las 12, porque estábamos felices. El niño me abrazaba, me besaba y me decía que me había extrañado tanto, que no quería que nos separáramos y que él cuando se iba a acostar allá, desde que se ponía a orar que iban a estar juntos y gracias a Dios estamos juntos.
That is, of course, one story worth seeing. That is one mother and one child. But I want to be clear for context. That is the exception among over 2,000 families split apart by Trump's order. Some children already transported thousands of miles away from their border crossing, like the girls in this video brought to New York City, as we've been reporting under the cover of night. Meanwhile, sources close to the First Lady say she has now come to visit the border because she was horrified by what she saw on television, meaning what she saw her own husband's policies were doing. Now, Donald Trump has lied about creating this policy. Then he lied about saying that it could not be fixed by executive order, which he then issued. Now Donald Trump says he wants to undo the thing he ordered. He says he wants these families together, while his Homeland Security Secretary is saying, instead of lying about Trump's orders, she wants to adopt this more measured tone. Take a look.
What about the kids who were already separated from their parents? The kids who were already separated from their parents?
Well, we want to put them together. We don't want to have we don't want to have children separated from their parents.
Secretary Nielsen, what happens to the kids now that have been separated from their parents? Why did you guys sign the order yesterday? So we're implementing it.
You read the order, so we're implementing it. Now, Secretary Nielsen there is talking to the public and the press, but she could be talking to herself, because the reporting suggests this whole process was so incompetently run that DHS and its experts were also literally reading that draft order and its last revisions yesterday, too, on the same day it came out. No time to clarify the order, apparently no time or desire to develop a plan to reunite these families, because Trump was rushing out of this mess as quickly and as precipitously and as thoughtlessly as he rushed into it. Now, for the administration's critics, as this week grinds on, some of these facts are a sign that Trump can be moved, that he will fold under enough pressure. And that may be something. But for everyone else around the nation impacted by these policies, these facts are something else. They are a sign that the problems created by this policy are far from over. They are just beginning. I am joined by New York Congressman Nydia Velázquez, who visited immigrant children separated from their families this week on Monday, and Michelle Brunet, director of the Women's Refugee Commission, who recently met with some of the, quote, tender-age children held down there in McAllen, Texas. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Congresswoman, what is happening on the Hill, where we're told Republicans plan to vote they couldn't achieve, and what needs to happen, in your view, to rectify what Donald Trump himself admits through this order was a bad plan?
Well, we just, the good legislation was defeated today. Tomorrow, we're going to be voting on the so-called compromise bill. Compromise because it was an agreement reached between the Freedom Caucus and Paul Ryan. That bill will not become law, and if it does, it will fail in the Senate. So we're going to find ourselves tomorrow without a real solution for a big problem and to deal with a crisis that has been created by Donald Trump.
Michelle, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I will say that Donald Trump's and the administration's cruelty is rivaled only by the incompetence of this administration. It was shown when the president signed the executive order, the Muslim ban. When I went to JFK, it was total chaos. People didn't know, the people on the ground, Customs and Border Patrol agents, they didn't know, they didn't have any guidelines. When I went to San Diego and we visited shelters and the Customs and Border Patrol, you saw also that they didn't have guidelines how to implement this policy. And at the end, children and families are the ones suffering. It was heart-wrenching what I saw. Not the America that I know, by the way.
I appreciate your points on that, Congresswoman. And Michelle, building on that point, we have some factual video here of Jeff Sessions that really underscores, I think, what the Congresswoman is saying and what we've been reporting, that there may be always some ideological differences on immigration, but the rank incompetence, the total lack of consistency, the kind of flip and even venal attitude about the lives and the children's lives that hang in the balance is really striking. Here is Jeff Sessions contradicting himself during a very short period of time.
It hasn't been good, and the American people don't like the idea that we're separating families. We never really intended to do that. What we intended to do was to make sure that adults who bring children into the country are charged with the crime they've committed. Our policies that can result in short-term separation of families is not unusual or unjustified, and it's really a very short period of time.
Michelle, part of my job is to be as fair as reasonably possible. The fairest reading of those two statements from Jeff Sessions is that he is lying very deliberately about the intent of the policy, which was to separate families. Now he says that wasn't the intent. Your response?
Look, it's been very clear since the beginning that the administration was looking for ways to separate families as a deterrent. We heard from as far back as March 2017, almost immediately after they came into office, Secretary Kelly went on television and said that they were considering separating families as a deterrent. He very quickly retracted that and said, well, they were just considering it, that maybe they wouldn't. He then must have gotten talking points saying, don't say we're trying to deter them. So he started framing it differently. This has come up repeatedly throughout the year until they finally came up with this plan of prosecuting parents, which ultimately clearly was intended to separate and to deter.
Michelle Brunet, thank you for your expertise. Congresswoman Velasquez, I know you have another piece of business to get to, so we had to let you go. I thank you both. We turn now to Jennifer Rubin, a conservative writer for the Washington Post opinion section, and Maya Wiley, former counsel to the mayor of New York City, who's worked on civil rights. Maya, this is something that has hit New York and hit a lot of other places because these children, if they're orphaned by Trump government policy, have to go somewhere. They have to live somewhere. We have to do something about it. Your view on what should happen next tonight?
Well, I think the United States government has to do everything in its power to reunite children with their parents immediately. We know that, as Representative Velasquez says, there hasn't really been an infrastructure or a plan to make that happen. In New York City, we know we have almost 300 children, some who've been brought in at apparently very early hours of the morning, questions about what kind of services and supports they need. These children need health care services. In some instances, they need educational support. And frankly, at this point, I would suggest that we need to think seriously about trauma counseling for these children. But at the end of the day, we have to reunite families, period.
Jennifer Rubin, the Republicans in Congress finally found something where they spoke with one voice against Donald Trump, although it would be our error to not note that they found their voices late and they found their voices after just about everyone else. Take a look at the new Time magazine cover that is making the rounds online. Welcome to America, Jennifer.
Yeah, exactly. This is a shabby episode in American history, the worst, I think, in terms of treatment of families and treatment of people of a specific ethnic background since the internment of the Japanese in World War II. There was never a plan when they set out to do this about how they were going to deal with the children, what sort of facilities they would be in, what standards would be abided by, what kind of personnel would be assigned to them, what would be the method of eventually reuniting them. None of that was worked out. And likewise, when Trump pulled the plug, as you correctly said, Ari, which he denied he was going to be able to do, there still is no plan for that. Moreover, if they reunite these families, then we're back to the so-called Flores settlement, which says, as of this moment, that the children cannot be held for more than 20 days. That's with or without a parent. So what is their solution to that? The last I heard, they were going to challenge the Flores settlement so that they can keep these families indefinitely in incarceration.
Right, in longer detention, which is the opposite of what the slice of humanitarianism in that original court decree is in obviously the other direction.
Exactly. And I want to be clear about how this got started. We never locked up people who committed the misdemeanor of attempting to enter the United States without authorization. First of all, these people probably do have a right to enter under our established rules of asylum. But secondly, we never incarcerated these people. It would be like we incarcerated everybody in America for jaywalking. And we said, oh, we didn't mean to separate them from their children, and we have no plans to keep them, but, oh, well, their parents are all in jail, so the kids have to be sent somewhere else. Totally unnecessarily, totally irresponsible. And we do have systems in place for tracking these people so they will return for their hearings. These processes work very well. Listen, if Paul Manafort could be out of jail with an ankle bracelet for some period of time, these people don't need to be incarcerated either.
It's not a news connection I was expecting to make, but a fair one. And this question to both of you, to Jennifer first. I mean, you just raised the specter of internment. We had an expert on earlier this week who talked about that terrible part of American history, which I should mention, by the way, was deemed, quote unquote, lawful at the time. The fact that something might technically be upheld by the courts doesn't give much moral or ethical focus to whether it's the policy we want to have as a nation. Now, some, Jennifer, might say to you, well, wait a minute, wasn't that a military thing? Isn't that different? And then we would have to quote the facts reported in your paper and elsewhere that say, actually, Donald Trump's Pentagon asked for 20,000 spaces for migrant children on, yes, military bases, notifying lawmakers that HHS wants to know whether beds could be provided for these children at military installations for occupancy as soon as July, that's next month, and as late as December 2018, Jennifer.
Yeah, I also want to make a point. In both the case of the internment of the Japanese and here, there was a phony public safety issue that was kicked up in order to panic people. You first dehumanize people, you then terrify the rest of the population, so it's easier to round these people up and get people not to care. In the case of the Japanese, the vast majority of them, as we know, were either native-born or naturalized citizens. The vast majority of these people are people running for their lives, and under the process that we go through, there is a process for them to seek refuge in the United States. These are not the M13 people that Trump keeps talking about. You'd have to be a really determined M13 person to go across the desert for days or weeks without food and water in order to get into the United States to join a gang. That's just preposterous. He has conflated criminals with refugees. He's conflated dreamers with people who have other designs on the United States, terrorists and the like. This is madness. It's moral madness. And the responsible lawmaker, of which we have none on the Republican side right now, would say, wait a second. These people that we're talking about, these families, these children, are no threat to the American people. We need to figure out a way to process them promptly in a humane fashion. We can find housing for them together as family in more appropriate settings, and we then have to process these people through the system. And guess what? If we don't have a system in place for holding these people, we have no business holding them. That's our moral obligation. As soon as we take them in and say, wait, our legal system doesn't allow you to stay here automatically, the burden shifts to us morally, from a humanitarian standpoint, to make sure that they are in decent condition. And if they're not, we should be releasing them.
Maya?
Well, first of all, we have a long history in this country before Japanese internment of ripping children from parents of color, from African slaves to Native Americans for whom we actually ripped children from their parents as well. So unfortunately, we have a long history in this country, but very much driven on stereotypes about who are humanized parents. And I think that's a really important point to remember. We should also remember it has actually been found unconstitutional since Japanese internment. One of the things that I think is the biggest ironies here, Donald Trump this morning said wrongly, and it was a lie, that the Democrats actually are more interested in protecting immigrants than American citizens. And that's a lie for two reasons. One, he has actually spent and is demanding that we spend much more money creating a border wall or actually incarcerating families for literally a crime that's similar to jaywalking, at the same time that he's actually proposed a budget that would ensure that 44 million Americans who are going hungry every day have less money available in food stamp programs to feed them, that ensure that it's harder for them to see a doctor when they're sick. We've even talked about gutting rural economic development programs that go straight to the needs of his own constituency, and I would argue is a really important program.
Sure.
So really what we have is leadership that has ignored both the research and the policies we know to work to solve our problems, and then in covering up his own mistakes and, frankly, his own driving of racial divisions, he's ignored us.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.